The first thing they unloaded wasn't furniture. It was a bright yellow survey stake. One of the movers walked straight past me, pushed it into the ground next to my mailbox, and said, "Boss wants the property lines marked before we start." I honestly thought they had the wrong address. Then I saw my cousin Mason step out of a white F-250, wearing mirrored sunglasses and carrying a thick folder like he'd been waiting years for this moment. He smiled when he saw me. "Morning, Ethan." Behind him, my Uncle Rick climbed out of the passenger seat, looked around the property, and took a long breath like he already owned the place. "Go ahead," he told the movers. "We're taking possession today." One of the movers hesitated. "The homeowner's standing right there." Rick barely looked at me. "Not anymore." He tapped the folder. "County made it official." I glanced toward the barn. Nothing moved. Exactly how I wanted it. Inside the farmhouse, our attorney was finishing one last phone call with investigators from the sheriff's office. Two detectives had been parked behind the equipment shed for almost 20 minutes, where nobody on the road could see them. Rick thought he was walking into his biggest victory. He was actually walking into a meeting he'd unknowingly scheduled for himself. Mason took another step toward the porch. "You've had plenty of time to move out." I nodded once. "I'd wait." He laughed. "You don't get to tell us what to do anymore." Before anyone else could say another word, the front door opened. Our attorney stepped outside holding a slim leather binder. She looked at the movers first, then at my uncle, then at the sheriff's SUV slowly rolling out from behind the barn. "I think," she said calmly, "everyone should stay exactly where they are." I should probably explain how we got there. I'm Ethan Brooks. I'm 34, and I work as a financial analyst for a regional manufacturing company in western Missouri. Numbers have always made more sense to me than people. Spreadsheets don't pretend to be something they're not. People do. The property everyone was standing on wasn't just a farm. It was nearly 250 acres outside Sedalia that had been in my family for over 50 years. There was the original farmhouse, a machine shed, several rental homes my grandfather had bought over the years, pasture land leased to neighboring ranchers, a few commercial buildings in town. Nothing flashy, just decades of careful decisions. By the time everything was appraised, the estate was worth somewhere around $5 million. Most people who drove past saw fences and cattle. My grandfather saw 40 years of mornings that started before sunrise. My grandparents, Harold and Evelyn Brooks, raised me after my parents divorced when I was 9. Dad moved to Arizona for work and eventually started another family. Mom struggled with addiction for years and drifted in and out of my life until we eventually stopped pretending we'd stay in touch. Grandpa never spoke badly about either of them. His rule was simple. Life's already hard enough without borrowing somebody else's bitterness. So I stayed. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. Then middle school became high school. High school became college. Even after graduating, I moved back home instead of buying a place in Kansas City. Some people thought I was giving up opportunities. I never saw it that way. Grandpa was getting older. Grandma had arthritis that made simple things harder every year. The farm needed someone who actually planned on sticking around. I did. Uncle Rick lived less than 30 minutes away. You'd think he would have been there all the time. He wasn't. Unless money somehow became part of the conversation. Rick had started more businesses than I could count. Roofing, pressure washing, used cars, storage units. A landscaping company that lasted one summer. Every new idea was supposedly the one that would finally make him rich. Every failure somehow became someone else's fault. Banks, partners, the economy. Never Rick. His son Mason wasn't much different. He was 5 years younger than me and had mastered the art of looking successful. Brand new truck, expensive watch, designer boots, almost all of it financed. He called debt leveraging. Grandpa called it living tomorrow on yesterday's promises. Family cookouts followed the same pattern every time. Grandma made enough food for 30 people. Neighbors stopped by. Kids ran through the yard. Then sooner or later, Rick found a way to pull Grandpa aside. Sometimes they talked near the barn, sometimes by the smoker, sometimes while everyone else watched football inside. The conversation always circled back to property. You ever think about selling part of the Northfield? No. Commercial developers are paying crazy money. I'm aware. You could simplify your life. Grandpa would smile. I already have. Rick never seemed to understand the answer. Or maybe he just refused to accept it. One evening after everyone had left, Grandpa and I were fixing a loose gate before dark. I asked why he kept entertaining those conversations. You know exactly what he's after. He tightened one last bolt before answering. Of course I do. So, why not tell him to quit asking? He rested both hands on the fence. Because people eventually show you who they are if you don't interrupt them. I laughed. That sounds backwards. No. He looked across the pasture. It saves time. When someone keeps believing you're listening, they'll usually tell you the whole plan. At the time, I thought he was just talking about Rick. Looking back, he was talking about everyone who eventually showed up with that moving truck. Grandpa never forgot a promise. That included the ones other people hoped he'd forgotten. When I was 15, Rick borrowed the farm's flatbed trailer for what he called a 2-day roofing job. 3 weeks later, Grandpa found it behind a pawn shop in Warrensburg. Rick had used the title as collateral for a short-term loan. The lender hadn't checked the paperwork closely enough to notice the trailer wasn't his. Grandpa paid the balance to get it back. He never mentioned the money again. But on the drive home, he said something I remembered years later. Helping someone once is kindness. He glanced at me. Helping them hide the same mistake over and over is participation. After that, Rick still asked for things. Grandpa just started saying no more often. Rick didn't take it well. By the time I finished college, I knew more about the farm's finances than anyone except Grandpa. He had me sit beside him every January while he organized tax documents. We reviewed rent payments from the houses in town, insurance on the commercial buildings, land leases, equipment depreciation. He showed me which accounts covered operating expenses and which ones were never touched unless something serious happened. Grandma used to tease us. You two can make a grocery receipt look like a federal investigation. She wasn't wrong. Grandpa kept records for everything. Receipts from 20 years earlier, copies of canceled checks, notes from meetings, updated property maps. He trusted people carefully and paper completely. At the time, I thought it was just how older farmers operated. Later, those records were the only reason Rick and Mason's plan failed as quickly as it did. Grandma's health started declining when I was 27. At first it was small. She left the stove on once, forgot where she'd put her purse, repeated a story she'd told 20 minutes earlier. Then one afternoon, she drove to a grocery store she'd used for years and couldn't remember the way home. A police officer found her sitting in the parking lot, crying because she knew something was wrong, but couldn't explain what. After that, Grandpa stopped pretending it was normal aging. The diagnosis was early-stage Alzheimer's. He didn't tell the whole family immediately. Not because he was ashamed. He wanted time to understand what the next few years would look like. Rick found out through a neighbor. 2 days later, he showed up carrying flowers and acting like the most concerned brother alive. He hadn't visited in nearly 3 months. Suddenly, he wanted to help with everything. Doctor appointments, banking, insurance forms, legal documents. Grandpa watched him perform for about 10 minutes before saying, "We've got it handled." Rick looked offended. "I'm family. So is Ethan. He's a kid." I was 27. Grandpa didn't bother correcting him. "He knows the situation." Rick leaned back in his chair. "Well, somebody should make sure things are organized before Evelyn gets worse." Grandpa's face didn't change. "They are. Who has power of attorney?" "That's private." "I'm just asking." "I know." That ended the conversation. Rick left without taking the flowers out of their plastic wrap. A week later, Grandpa called me into his office. The room smelled like coffee, printer paper, and the cedar blocks Grandma kept in every cabinet. He had 3 folders arranged across the desk. One had my name on it. Another was labeled property. The third said medical. "Sit down." I did. He closed the office door. "I need you to understand something." The seriousness in his voice made me uncomfortable. "Okay." "Your uncle believes this family owes him." I looked at the folders. "For what?" "He'd have to answer that." Grandpa folded his hands. "But people who feel owed rarely wait to be given anything." He explained that he had already met with an estate attorney in Jefferson City. He'd updated his will, created a trust, transferred several properties into it, changed the way rental income and investments would be managed if either he or Grandma became unable to make decisions. Most of it went over my head at first. Not because it was complicated, because I didn't want to think about why he was doing it. "You think something's going to happen to you?" "Eventually?" "That's not what I mean." He gave me a tired smile. "I'm not dying today, Ethan. But waiting until you're sick to protect what you've built is like buying fire insurance while the barn's burning." That sounded exactly like him. Practical enough to make something frightening feel ordinary. His attorney's name was Caroline Price. She was in her late 40s, wore dark glasses, and had the kind of calm voice that made people lower theirs without realizing it. Our first meeting lasted almost 4 hours. Grandpa had already made most of the decisions. Caroline reviewed the trust line by line. The farmhouse and surrounding acreage would remain together. The rental homes would continue producing income. The commercial properties could be sold only under specific conditions. Grandma would be protected for life. After both of them were gone, I would become the sole trustee and beneficiary. I stopped her there. "What about Rick?" Grandpa answered. "What about him?" "He's your brother." "That's true." "And Mason?" "Also true." I waited for more. Nothing came. Caroline looked at Grandpa. "Do you want me to explain the letter?" He nodded. She opened another folder. Grandpa had written a formal statement explaining why Rick would receive no ownership interest in the estate. It listed unpaid loans, business debts Grandpa had settled for him, equipment Rick had sold without permission, repeated pressure to break up the farm, attempts to involve Grandma in financial conversations after her diagnosis. There was no anger in the letter. That somehow made it harsher. It read like an audit. Rick had spent years treating family trusts like an account he could overdraw. Grandpa had finally closed it. On the drive home, I asked whether leaving Rick nothing would make things worse. Grandpa kept his eyes on the highway. "It probably will." "Then why do it?" "Because peace bought with property isn't peace." A few miles passed. Then he added, "And I won't reward someone for waiting on my funeral." That was the first time I understood how closely he'd been watching Rick. Not just recently, for years. As Grandma's memory declined, Rick visited more often. Mason started coming with him. They brought groceries nobody asked for, offered to repair things that weren't broken, asked questions that sounded harmless until you heard enough of them. Which bank handled the farm accounts? Were all the deeds stored at the house? Did Grandpa still sign his own checks? Had the attorney prepared anything new? Grandpa answered almost none of it. Mason tried a different approach with me. He'd catch me alone near the barn or equipment shed. Must be nice knowing all this lands in your lap. I usually ignored him. One afternoon, he kept going. You don't even want the whole place. What makes you think that? You work in town. You wear clean shoes. I looked down at my boots, which were covered in mud. Great point. He didn't appreciate that. I'm saying you could sell it and be done. Grandpa isn't selling. I'm talking about later. That word hung there. Later. Like he already had a date in mind. I stepped closer. You spend a lot of time planning around people dying. Mason smiled. Everybody does. No. I walked past him. Not everybody. That evening, I told Grandpa about the conversation. He didn't look surprised. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and handed me a small digital recorder. What's this? Keep it. For what? In case he says something useful. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Then he handed me a key. It opened a safe deposit box at a bank across town. Inside were certified copies of the trust, original property records, signature samples, tax documents, and a sealed letter addressed to me. I started to open it. Grandpa stopped me. Not yet. When? You'll know. I put the envelope back. Before closing the box, I noticed one more folder. It contained recent copies of every deed connected to the farm. Each one had been certified by the county recorder, less than 2 weeks earlier. I looked at Grandpa. Why do you need new copies of deeds you've owned for decades? He closed the box. Because if anyone ever changes them, we'll know exactly what changed. He said it like a general precaution. But on the drive home, I noticed him checking the rearview mirror more than usual. That was when I started wondering whether Grandpa was protecting the farm from something he suspected might happen, or something he already knew had started. Grandma passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in early October. The previous evening, she'd smiled at me while I was making dinner and asked if we'd invited Grandpa's parents over for Thanksgiving. They'd both been gone for decades. Grandpa didn't correct her. He just smiled back and said, "We'll see." It was the last full conversation they ever had. She passed in her sleep before sunrise. The funeral brought people I hadn't seen in years. Second cousins, former neighbors, old church friends. Rick stood near the front, greeting everyone like he was hosting the service. Mason wandered through the crowd, shaking hands with people who barely remembered his name. More than once I overheard him saying things like, "We'll keep Grandpa's legacy going." I never asked what he meant. I had a feeling I already knew. After everyone left the cemetery, Grandpa and I sat on the back porch until dark. Neither of us said much. Finally, he broke the silence. You know what surprised me today? I shook my head. Rick never asked how I was doing. I thought back through the whole day. He was right. Not once. He asked Caroline where she parked. He asked the banker whether he'd be coming by this week. He asked the county assessor how often they update tax records. Grandpa stared across the pasture. Funny things to wonder about after burying your sister-in-law. Grandma had handled most of the family's social life. Without her, the house became quieter than I'd ever remembered. Grandpa filled the silence by working. If he wasn't fixing fences, he was organizing paperwork. If he wasn't organizing paperwork, he was walking property lines with an old survey map folded into his back pocket. One Saturday, I asked why he kept checking boundary markers that hadn't moved in decades. He shrugged. I like knowing where things begin and end. I thought he meant the land. Looking back, he wasn't talking about fences. About 6 months later, Grandpa suffered a mild stroke. He recovered better than anyone expected. Within a few weeks, he was walking again, still driving, still arguing with the feed supplier over invoice totals. But something changed afterward. He became even more deliberate. Every document got copied twice. Every account statement was filed the day it arrived. Every legal conversation included Caroline. One afternoon, she came out to the farm carrying another stack of papers. After they finished reviewing everything, she asked me to stay behind. Your grandfather has updated the trust again. Again? He reviews it every year. Is that normal? For most people? She smiled. No? For Harold Brooks? Absolutely. Grandpa passed away 11 months after Grandma. It happened the way he'd always said he wanted. At home, in his own recliner. The television was on. His coffee cup was half full. One of his old baseball games was playing quietly in the background. The paramedics said it was quick. I was grateful for that. It didn't make things easier, just simpler. 3 days later, Caroline met me at her office. She placed a thick binder on the conference table. Everything is exactly the way Harold intended. For almost 2 hours, she walked me through every asset: the farmland, rental homes, commercial buildings, investment accounts, farm equipment, insurance policies. Nothing had been left exposed. Everything already belonged to the trust. There would be no probate, no lengthy estate process, no decisions left for distant relatives. Finally, she reached the last section. You are now the trustee. I nodded. I figured. She slid one final envelope across the table. It was Grandpa's handwritten letter. Not emotional, not dramatic, just honest. If I was reading it, it meant he was gone. He reminded me that land wasn't the most valuable thing he'd leave behind. The freedom to make decisions without owing anyone was. Then he wrote one sentence that stuck with me. Never negotiate with people who mistake your kindness for permission. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. The family meeting took less than 20 minutes. Rick walked in smiling. Mason looked like he'd barely slept from excitement. Caroline explained how the trust worked. That every transfer had already been completed years earlier. That there was nothing left to divide. Rick interrupted. So who gets the farm? Caroline looked at him. Ethan. And the rentals? Ethan. The commercial buildings? Ethan. Mason laughed. That's not possible. It is. Rick leaned back in his chair. My brother would have never cut me out. Caroline opened another folder. He didn't. He documented exactly why. She handed him Harold's letter. Rick barely read the first page before throwing it back onto the table. This is garbage. It's legally binding, Caroline answered. So is the trust. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued after that. Rick simply stood up. This isn't finished. He walked out. Mason followed without saying a word. As the front door closed behind them, Caroline quietly gathered the folders. They're not going to accept this. You really think they'll fight it? She looked directly at me. I don't think they'll challenge the trust. They'll try to go around it. At the time, I wasn't sure what she meant. A few weeks later, I found out. The first fake document showed up at the county recorder's office before the month was over. The first call came from a tenant named Mr. Holloway. He rented one of the duplexes Grandpa had owned for almost 15 years. He wasn't the type to call unless something actually mattered. "Ethan," he said, "I figured you'd want to know." "What's going on?" "A guy stopped by saying he was taking over the property." I sat up a little straighter. "What guy?" "He introduced himself as Rick Brooks." My stomach tightened. "What exactly did he say?" "He told me future rent checks needed to be made out to someone else because ownership had changed." I looked across my office at the framed picture of Grandpa hanging over the filing cabinet. "Did you pay him?" "No. I told him I'd wait until I heard from you." "You did the right thing." Before hanging up, he added one more thing. He seemed awfully confident. By the end of the week, 3 more tenants called. Same story. Rick or Mason would stop by, flash a folder, mention lawyers, talk about new ownership. None of them showed actual paperwork. Just enough to make people nervous. Caroline wasn't surprised. "They're fishing." "For what?" "Someone willing to believe them." "So, what do? We document every visit." She drafted a letter explaining that ownership hadn't changed and mailed copies to every tenant. She also told each property manager to report anyone claiming authority over the rentals. It seemed excessive. A month later, I realized she hadn't been nearly cautious enough. The first attorney's letter arrived the following Monday. Rick claimed Grandpa lacked the mental capacity to create the trust. According to his lawyer, I'd manipulated an elderly man into rewriting his estate. I almost laughed. If anyone had ever tried manipulating Grandpa, they would have given up within 5 minutes. Caroline didn't laugh. She simply opened another folder. Medical evaluations. She placed them on the table. 3 separate cognitive assessments. Another folder. Video recordings of the trust signing. Another. Witness affidavits. Grandpa had prepared for this years before. Not because he expected to lose, because he expected someone else to try. The lawsuit never made it very far. Rick's attorney requested bank records. Caroline already had organized copies. They wanted medical files, already certified. Property records, already authenticated. Every claim they made ran into another document Grandpa had saved. After 2 months, the case quietly disappeared. Rick never admitted defeat. He just stopped talking about it. That should have worried me more than it did. For almost 6 weeks, everything became strangely quiet. No letters, no phone calls, no unexpected visitors. Even Mason disappeared. I started thinking maybe they'd finally accepted reality. Caroline disagreed. People who believe something belongs to them rarely quit. They change tactics. I asked what she thought the next tactic would be. "I don't know, but I guarantee they're planning one." A few days later, I had to stop by the county recorder's office to pick up certified copies of a survey for one of the commercial buildings. While I waited, the deputy recorder recognized my last name. "Everything getting sorted after your grandfather passed?" "So far." He hesitated. "You might want to keep an eye on your property records." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He shook his head. "Probably nothing. It just never hurts to check once in a while." At the time, it sounded like friendly advice. Looking back, I think he was trying to warn me without accusing anyone of anything. About 3 weeks later, Caroline called before 8 in the morning. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "I need you in my office." "Is something wrong?" "I'd rather show you. When I got there, a certified copy of a deed was waiting on the conference table. At first glance, it looked legitimate. County stamp, recording number, legal description of the property. Then I saw the names. According to the document, I transferred the farmhouse and nearly 60 surrounding acres to Rick Brooks. I stared at it. I've never seen this. I know. My signature. It isn't yours. It looked close. Close enough that someone who barely knew me might believe it. But I noticed the small differences immediately. The way the E curved. The way I crossed my T. Someone had practiced. Just not enough. Caroline pointed toward the bottom of the page. Look at the notary. I did. The seal looked official, until she flipped over another document. The notary's commission expired 5 years ago. I looked back at the deed. They actually recorded this? They did. And because it was accepted for recording, Rick is now pretending it's legitimate. I leaned back in my chair. This can't be real. It gets worse. She handed me another filing. A private lender had approved a large short-term loan using the farmhouse as collateral. The loan had been issued less than a week after the forged deed was recorded. Someone had borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars against land they didn't own. For the first time since Grandpa died, I understood exactly what he had been preparing for. Rick wasn't trying to win an inheritance anymore. He was trying to manufacture one. Caroline closed the folder and looked me straight in the eye. I'm calling the sheriff. And after that, she tapped the forged deed. We're going to let your uncle explain how this ended up in the county records. The detective assigned to the case introduced himself as Ben Torres. He wasn't much older than me. No dramatic speeches, no television-style interrogation. He walked into Caroline's conference room carrying a legal pad and spent almost 10 minutes reading the forged deed without saying a word. Finally, he looked up. How many originals were filed? Caroline slid another folder across the table. So far, 1 deed and 2 supporting affidavits. So whoever did this wasn't testing the waters. No. They intended to use it. Torres nodded. I figured. An investigator from the county recorder's office joined us about an hour later. She carried certified copies of every filing connected to the property over the previous 6 months. Most were routine. Tax updates, survey references, utility easements. Then she reached the forged deed. She frowned. This should have been flagged. Torres looked over. Why wasn't it? The recording office verifies formatting. She tapped the page. We don't verify whether people are lying. I hadn't thought about that. Recording a document didn't mean the county believed it. It simply meant someone had submitted paperwork that met filing requirements. The real damage happened afterward. People assumed recorded meant legitimate. Rick was counting on exactly that. Over the next week, investigators subpoenaed records from the private lender that had approved the loan. The file came back surprisingly fast. Application forms, income statements, copies of the forged deed, bank wiring instructions, even copies of Rick's driver's license. He hadn't hidden behind shell companies. He'd signed everything himself. Torres stared at the paperwork. I've seen smarter criminals. Caroline smiled. My client appreciates that. The wire transfer told the rest of the story. Nearly $300,000 had been deposited into an account belonging to one of Mason's construction companies. Within 48 hours, most of it was gone. Truck payments, credit cards, past due business loans, equipment leases, a vacation rental in Florida. Torres shook his head. They didn't invest it. They spent it. Caroline closed the folder. Which means recovering it won't be easy. The following Monday, I stopped by the farm before work. Everything looked normal. The cattle were in the south pasture. The machine shed doors were open. A delivery truck from the feed mill had just left. Then I noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the old equipment barn. I followed them. Someone had driven all the way to the back of the property over the weekend. Nothing appeared missing. Still, it bothered me. I checked the security cameras Grandpa had installed a few years earlier. Most covered the driveway. A couple watched the rental houses. One overlooked the machine shed. The camera near the back gate showed exactly what I expected. Rick's pickup. Saturday afternoon. He'd driven through the property, stopped near the barn for several minutes, then left. He never got out. Almost like he was checking whether anyone was home. I copied the footage and sent it to Torres. His response came less than 10 minutes later. Don't confront him. Keep recording everything. A few days later, another tenant called. This time it was Mrs. Alvarez, who rented one of the smaller houses in town. Ethan. She sounded nervous. There are 2 men here. I already knew who. They're saying the sheriff's office is about to remove me if I keep paying you. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Don't hand them anything. I won't. Are they still outside? Yes. I've already called the police. By the time officers arrived, Rick and Mason were gone. They'd left before anyone could question them. But Mrs. Alvarez had done one thing they hadn't expected. She'd recorded the entire conversation on her phone. The video clearly showed Mason claiming he represented the legal owner of every Brooks property. Torres watched it twice, then looked at me. They're digging the hole deeper. 2 mornings later, Caroline called. I've got good news. I could use some. The lender has frozen the remaining loan funds. So they can't touch what's left? Correct. The bad news, she sighed. I don't think they're done. That afternoon, she asked me to come by her office. Spread across her conference table were aerial maps of the farm, copies of the trust, photographs from the security cameras, and a printed timeline of everything Rick and Mason had done since Grandpa died. She pointed to one date. This is when the forged deed was recorded. Then another. This is when they borrowed the money. Then another. This is when they started visiting tenants. She paused. They've already convinced themselves they own the property. I frowned. What difference does that make? It means the next step won't be paperwork. It'll be possession. I wasn't sure I understood. Caroline folded the timeline and slipped it back into the folder. People committing this kind of fraud usually make one final mistake. What's that? They eventually show up expecting everyone else to believe the lie. She was right. 3 days later, just after sunrise on a Thursday, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Have your things packed by tomorrow morning. Movers arrive at 9. No signature. No explanation. Just one sentence. I forwarded it to Caroline. She called almost immediately. Don't answer it. I wasn't planning to. Good. Then she lowered her voice. Tomorrow? Be at the farmhouse by 8. What happens at 9? She was quiet for a moment. Rick and Mason are finally going to commit their biggest mistake. And this time, they'll do it in front of witnesses. Friday morning started quieter than I expected. By 7:45, I was already at the farmhouse with a cup of coffee that had gone cold sitting on the porch rail. Caroline arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 binders and her laptop. She looked around the property once before coming inside. They'll use the front driveway. How do you know? Because they want an audience. That sounded strange, until I realized she was right. If Rick truly believed his forged paperwork made him the owner, he wouldn't sneak onto the property. He'd want everyone to watch him take it. At 8:30, Detective Torres and another investigator pulled in through the back pasture entrance. Their SUV stayed hidden behind the machine shed. A sheriff's deputy parked farther back, where the road couldn't be seen from the house. Nobody wore tactical gear. No flashing lights. Just plain clothes. Torres stepped inside and looked around the kitchen. Nice place. My grandparents built most of it. He nodded. Let's hope it stays that way. He checked his watch. If they show up, nobody argues. You let them talk. The more they explain, the easier my report becomes. Caroline smiled. I've been telling Ethan the same thing. At exactly 8:58, we heard the first diesel engine. Torres walked over to the front window. They're early. A white moving truck rolled slowly up the gravel driveway. Behind it came Rick's black pickup. Mason followed in a gray SUV. 3 movers climbed out of the truck. They looked confused more than anything else. Probably because nobody had mentioned there would still be people living in the house. One of them walked toward the porch, carrying a clipboard. Morning. You Ethan? I am. We're scheduled to move household contents. Rick interrupted before the man could say anything else. Don't bother asking him. He doesn't own this place anymore. Rick climbed the porch steps, holding a thick folder under his arm. He looked happier than I'd seen him in years. You've had enough time. I tried doing this the easy way. I didn't answer. He pulled out a certified copy of the forged deed. County accepted it. I've got legal ownership. You need to be out before lunch. The lead mover shifted awkwardly. Sir? I just need whoever owns the property to sign the work authorization. Rick pointed at himself. I'll sign. The mover looked at me, then back at Rick. Something about the situation clearly didn't feel right. Mason walked toward the front door, carrying a box of heavy-duty contractor bags. Start with the office, he told one of the movers. We'll sort everything later. Nobody moved. The foreman cleared his throat. We're not removing property while people are still living here. Rick's patience started slipping. You've got paperwork. So do I. He waved the forged deed again. This isn't complicated. Before anyone else could speak, Caroline stepped onto the porch. She carried only one thin folder. Nothing else. Good morning, Rick. His smile disappeared. I figured you'd show up. I had it on my calendar. He laughed. Perfect. You can explain to Ethan why this is over. Caroline nodded politely. I'd rather explain something else. She opened the folder and removed one document. You recognize this deed? Rick smiled. Of course. I recorded it. You certainly did. She handed it back. Would you mind telling everyone here when Ethan signed it? Rick answered without hesitation. Last spring. At my office. Caroline tilted her head. Interesting. She looked at the movers. Would any of you mind staying a few minutes longer? The foreman frowned. Is there a problem? Possibly. I think you're about to become witnesses. The word witnesses changed the atmosphere immediately. The movers stopped unloading equipment. Nobody said another word. Then another engine echoed across the property. This one came from behind the barn. Rick turned toward the sound just as Detective Torres drove into view. A second SUV followed behind him, then the marked sheriff's unit. The lead mover quietly muttered, "Well, this isn't normal." Torres parked near the porch, stepped out, and adjusted the badge clipped to his belt. "Morning, everyone?" His tone was casual, like he was arriving to inspect a fence instead of investigate multiple felonies. Rick looked from Torres to Caroline. "What is this supposed to be?" Torres answered. "Hopefully a short conversation." He walked up the steps and held out his hand. "I'm Detective Ben Torres. I've been reviewing some documents with your name on them." Rick didn't shake it. "I've done nothing wrong." "We'll get to that." Torres accepted the silence and continued. "I understand you're claiming ownership of this property." "I am, and you're relying on a deed recorded 6 weeks ago." "That's right." Torres nodded once. "Good. Because that's exactly where I'd like to begin." Mason took one slow step backward. It was subtle, but Torres noticed. So did I. And judging by the look on Caroline's face, she'd been expecting that reaction all along. Torres waited until everyone was looking at him. Then he held up a certified copy of the deed. "Mr. Brooks, you stated this was signed last spring at your office." Rick folded his arms. "That's correct." "Who notarized it?" "My attorney handled that." "Which attorney?" Rick hesitated. "I'd have to check." Torres nodded. "That might be difficult." He pointed to the seal near the bottom of the page. "The notary listed here hasn't held an active commission in 5 years." Mason looked at his father. Rick didn't look back. Torres continued. "We also compared Ethan's signature on this deed to his bank records, tax filings, employment documents, and the original trust." He paused. "They don't match." Rick gave a short laugh. "Signatures change." "They do." Caroline stepped beside Torres. "But Ethan was in Denver for a work conference on the date you claim he signed this in Missouri." She opened her folder. "Hotel records, airline receipts, security footage from the conference center." Rick's face tightened. "That proves nothing." "It proves he wasn't in your office." Mason set the contractor bags on the ground. "This is ridiculous. We were told everything was legal." Torres turned toward him. "Who told you?" Mason glanced at Rick. Nobody spoke. Torres pulled another document from his folder. "Maybe we should discuss the loan." The color left Mason's face. "What loan?" "The $287,000 bridge loan issued against this property." He looked down at the paperwork. Funds were deposited into an account owned by MKB Renovations, Mason's company. Torres continued reading. "Within 2 days, money was used to pay off your truck, several credit cards, equipment leases, and a past due commercial note." Mason stopped pretending he didn't understand. "That was business money, secured by property you didn't own." "I thought Dad owned it." Rick finally turned on him. "Stop talking." Torres looked between them. "Actually, I'd prefer he continue." The moving foreman slowly lowered his clipboard. "Are we free to leave?" Torres nodded. "We'll need your names and contact information first." The man looked at Rick. "You told us this was an eviction." "It is." "No," Caroline said. "It isn't." The foreman shook his head. "We don't get paid enough for this." His crew packed the ramp and straps back into the truck. Within a few minutes, they were waiting beside the cab while a deputy collected their information. Rick watched them like their refusal was somehow the biggest betrayal of the morning. Then he turned to me. "You set this up." I leaned against the porch rail. "You sent the movers." "You knew we'd come." "You texted me the time." He pointed at Caroline. You people have been building a case behind our backs. Torres answered for me. We've been investigating recorded evidence of fraud. That's not the same thing, Rick scoffed. This is a family disagreement. Caroline's voice stayed level. A family disagreement is arguing over who gets Grandma's dining table. Forging a deed and borrowing money against someone else's home is a crime. Rick started talking faster. He said Grandpa had promised him part of the land years earlier. He said the trust was unfair. He said he'd spent his whole life helping the family. He said, I would have sold everything eventually anyway. None of it answered the only question that mattered. Why had he filed a deed with my forged signature? Torres asked him 3 different ways. Rick never gave a direct answer. Instead, he kept explaining why he deserved the property. That was the closest he ever came to admitting what he'd done. He believed wanting it badly enough made the paperwork a technicality. Mason tried separating himself from the whole thing. He claimed Rick had prepared every document, said he only accepted the loan because his father told him the farm was theirs. Torres opened another file. Is this your signature? He showed Mason the lender application. Mason looked down. Yes. And this affidavit stating you personally verified the deed? Silence. Torres flipped another page. You signed that too. Mason's shoulders dropped. For the first time all morning, he looked less like a businessman and more like a scared kid who'd followed his father too far. Rick noticed. Don't say anything else. That was when the deputy stepped forward. Richard Brooks, turn around. Rick stared at him. You're arresting me? For forgery, filing false instruments, fraudulent use of real property, and obtaining funds under false pretenses. The deputy looked at Mason. Mason Brooks, you too. Rick didn't fight. He just kept talking. This will get thrown out. My lawyer will fix it. Harold wanted me to have that land. Nobody answered him. As the deputy secured the handcuffs, Rick looked directly at me. You'd put your own family in jail over property? I stepped closer. No, you put yourself there over property. He opened his mouth, but I continued. Grandpa gave you money. He paid your debts. He trusted you with equipment. He gave you chance after chance. You decided none of that counted because he wouldn't give you everything. Rick looked away. The deputy guided him toward the cruiser. Mason followed a few steps behind with his hands cuffed in front of him. He never looked at me. The criminal case took almost 10 months. Rick eventually pleaded guilty to forgery, fraudulent filing, and financial fraud. Mason accepted a separate deal for his role in the loan application and false affidavits. Neither went to prison for as long as people expected, but both served time. They were ordered to repay the lender, though most of the money had already been spent. The lender's claim against the farm was removed. Every false document was declared void. The county restored the ownership record exactly as it had been before Rick filed anything. The trust never changed. Grandpa's planning held up through every hearing. Caroline brought the final court order to the farmhouse the following spring. I was replacing boards along the west fence when she pulled into the driveway. She handed me the envelope. It's finished. I read the first page while standing beside her truck. No appeals? None. No more liens? None. The property record is clean. I folded the order and put it back in the envelope. For months, I'd imagined feeling relieved when it ended. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Caroline seemed to understand. Your grandfather made this easier than it could have been. I know. He knew Rick might challenge the estate. I looked toward the farmhouse. I don't think he expected all of this. She thought about it. Maybe not every detail. But he understood the people involved. I still live on the farm. I kept my job in town, but I manage the leases and property accounts from Grandpa's old office. The same filing cabinets are there. So is his coffee-stained calculator. I replaced the back gate and added 2 more cameras near the equipment barn. That would have made him laugh. He always said I waited until something broke before deciding it needed maintenance. A few weeks after the case ended, I finally opened the sealed letter from the safe deposit box. Most of it covered practical things. Which contractor? To call for the barn roof. Where he kept the original tractor manuals. Which tenant? Always paid late, but never failed to pay. Near the end, he wrote about Rick. He said he regretted helping him without demanding responsibility in return. Not because of the money. Because every rescue had taught Rick that consequences belong to somebody else. The final line was simple. Protect what we built, but don't let protecting it turn you into him. I put the letter back in its envelope. Then I walked outside and finished the fence. The farm stayed in the family. Just not with the people who believed being family meant they were allowed to steal it.